So, obviously, I'm a Turbogears guy, but I have used Django. I'm not completely unaware of what's going on in the Django world. And really, I just wanted to start off by saying I'm very happy that Django exists. I'm very happy to have the competition, and I'm very happy I think Django is good for Python. I think Django is good for the web community in Python generally. I do have a couple of things that a couple of issues to press, and so we will see how that all goes. But I really want Django to be successful. And that's why I agreed to come here and talk about what we can do to make Django more successful. I'm not here to bash on Django or to say horrible things about Django. I guess that gets into my next slide, which is why would I come here and talk, and what do I have to say? And mainly, I want to say there's a lot that we can learn from the history of Python web development, and I think we've learned some of the lessons, but we haven't learned all of the lessons, and I'm somewhat concerned that Django is repeating some of the mistakes of the past. So we will talk about all that, and hopefully I'll get done kind of quickly and have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I'm here because I want Django to be successful. I'm here also because there's stuff in Django that I would like to use, and it's harder than I would like it to be. So there's several things to talk about. But then what's up with the Zope part of the title? Well, this is not the first time that Python has had a wildly successful web framework that people loved. Django is not the first one to arrive in this position. Zope did it. And so I want to talk a little bit about the history of that and what happened, and maybe how we can avoid having that happen again. So if you don't understand history, then you're doomed to repeat it. It's sort of a truism, and maybe you're not doomed to, but you certainly don't know how to avoid it if you don't understand what happened. So I'm going to try and talk about that so that we can change the future. So this is just totally a process. Like, I'm going to try and do 3 sort of quick talks. One about the past, one about the present, and one about the future. So they're very, very short, and the Brain Rules book says that people won't pay attention for more than 10 minutes, so I'm doing 3 10-minute talks instead of a longer talk. So the first talk is about the past. And as I said before, there used to be a wildly popular web framework in Python. Everyone loved it. Well, maybe not everyone, but many, many people loved it. It was amazing. And I've already given away that it's Zope. And it really was amazing. When Bobo came out, it revolutionized the way that we thought about web development. Before, we were all doing CGI, and it was kind of like, yeah. And CGI is CGI. I mean, there's some good things and some bad things about it. But Bobo, which was sort of the original component that turned into Zope, it really revolutionized the way that you thought about HTTP requests. And what happens? They went through something, and they called a Python function. And you figured it out, and it did it. And everyone does that now. But that's not the way it was before. It used to be you had a Python script, and it responded. And it was very different. And it really did make people more productive. It provided a set of tools. It was great stuff. And I remember when Bobo came out, I was excited. I was like, oh, this is awesome. But that's not true anymore. At PyCon, not this year, but last year, there was a web frameworks developers panel. And on the panel, there were a number of people. And Jim Fulton, the author of Zope, was sitting in the middle. And people went through and said why they started their framework. And the first person to say why they started their framework, the first thing out of his mouth was, well, I took one look at Zope, and I ran away screaming. And that's a big, I mean, it's 6 years, but it's a big difference from 2000, 1999, when people loved Zope. And so what happened in that 6 years? What changed? And could that happen to Django? And I think there's many reasons to think that it will not happen to Django, but there are some reasons to think that it could. And so I want to talk about those things. There's many things, many lessons learned from the mistakes of Zope that we have learned. Zope did all this through the web development, and there was lots of untrusted code, and so there was lots of things in the framework to manage the fact that you had untrusted code that didn't live in files, it lived in the database, and there was some crazy things that really were hard to deal with. And Django is not doing any of those things. So those lessons are learned. But there are some other things that I think went wrong, and I just want to talk about those for a little bit. So one of the things that Zope was famous for was the Z-shaped learning curve. You get started, and you could do this through the web development, and it was really easy, and bam, things are getting going, and awesome. And then you hit a wall. And it's worse than a wall. You have to go backwards, because suddenly everything you thought you knew, you don't know. And it's horrible, and you go backwards, and then you get to the top, and now you understood all of Zope, and you've grokked it, and it is in your brain, and you can go forward, and things are awesome again. So that was the Z-shaped learning curve. And there's some similarities to Django, right? People love the admin, because they can get started, and they're like, bam. And new forms admin and the new admin is much more customizable than the old one. But the old one, you get started, and you go, oh, I have all this. And then what do you do next? You have to completely go back and do something else in a lot of cases. And so there was some Z-shaped learning curve in Django. But also, I think the big thing that causes Z-shaped learning curve is that Zope was this giant monolithic thing that sat in the middle of the Python community, and it was separate. It was separate from the rest of the Python world. If you used Zope, you used Zope. If you used CGI, you didn't use Zope. You didn't use some part of Zope in your CGI. Or if you used WebWare or SkunkWeb or any of the other web frameworks that came a generation before us, you didn't use any part of Zope. You either were in it or you were out of it, which meant that you didn't already know Zope when you started, ever, because you couldn't have used it in any of your previous projects, because Zope was this big sort of monolithic whole. And that is somewhat true of Django. People use databases outside of Django, but very, very few. I mean, does anyone use the Django ORM but not Django? See? So you don't use Django at all? Right. No, I'm saying, if you've never used Django, do you use the Django ORM? No. The only reason to use the Django ORM is because you already know it because you use Django. I'm not saying that that's the only reason to use it, but you're not going to see somebody from outside perceive that maybe the Django ORM is the right solution for their GUI framework. And maybe it is. I don't know. But nobody's going to have that thought, because the Django ORM is part of Django. And, and people who write GUI frameworks, write other things, write command line scripts. If they use an ORM, they use SQL Alchemy or SQL Object or something that's not perceived as being part of some big whole that they have to buy into. So I've heard that Django is actually tightly integrated but loosely coupled. So maybe that this whole Zope thing is not really true, and you can just use whatever Django parts you want. Has anyone heard this? It's kind of a slogan. So it's just not like Zope 2. That's sort of the argument. But the counter argument, I think, is this. This is a Django dependency diagram. And I had to zoom out so far you can't see the names of any of the modules. But those lines all go from one module to another module saying what depends on what. And that's for all of Django. So it's very hard to figure out what exactly that means, other than it kind of looks pretty. So this is inside Django DB. Just inside Django DB, what are the dependencies? And obviously, there are a lot of them. But you can see some organizations starting to appear on the smaller scales. Here's Django core. You can see in the middle is the config. There's a bunch of stuff. But you can see there's some dependencies. Yesterday, Adrian said, hey, you want to use the file abstraction layer outside of Django, just import it. Well, sort of. Like, you can, but you're probably importing a lot more than you think. And you don't really know what you're getting when you import some piece of Django, because it's not really clear where those lines are. So it does make it a little more disconcerting to come from the outside and say, oh, I'm just going to use one little piece. It's really hard to know, is that piece connected to lots and lots of other bits? And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And you'd have to spend some time trying to figure out what is and what isn't. And it's not obvious, at least from the outside, what those places are. So I'm not showing off because Turbogears is awesome, but I'm just showing off because this is what the Turbogears dependency diagram looks like. And you can actually almost read the names of things. And that's just, we have a lot less code. And in a lot of cases, there's something like SQL Alchemy or pylons. There's just some third-party package that it's just a circle. And we import that one thing, and then it has dependencies. But the dependency graph inside of Turbogears is much less confusing. Now, that doesn't mean Turbogears is better than Django, but it is, I think, a difference between the two philosophies. One philosophy is very much, we'll create everything ourselves, and the other is we're going to reuse external components. Well, one of the benefits of making something an external component is it's very hard to depend on each other. I mean, you can do it, but it makes you look like an idiot. And when everything's all in one big, giant package, it doesn't make you look like an idiot when everything depends on everything else. Because people don't see that. They just install the package, and they're good. But if they see, like, this egg requires these 200 other eggs, then you look terrible. So there's some social pressure in the Turbogears community to keep the dependency chain cleaner. But who cares? I mean, really, why would you even, like, it's a dependency graph. This is boring shit. Nobody cares, right? But, I mean, there are some consequences, right? The file storage abstraction stuff. Like, I really don't know. Like, I want to use some in a project, but am I going to import the one from Django, or should I just go and look at what Django has and rip it out and make something else, which was sort of Adrian's other suggestion, like steal our code and make a new project, which actually I think has happened before. Jinja took Django templates and made Django templates that weren't part of Django, and then they've gone on and done lots of new things. And that work is completely split off from Django. I don't know if that's good or bad. And some Django template fans will say it's good, and some Jinja template fans will say it's bad. Whatever. But Armin, who did Jinja, could have contributed lots of interesting things to Django people. And there are Django people here who are using Jinja. That could be part of Django, and that could be sort of standard if those people were working together. But they're not, because like Armin had to fork the code in order to have it work outside of Django. And then once he had it forked, then he kept improving it, but outside. Another sort of example, and this is more just fragmenting of developer attention, is there's PyAMF and Django AMF. And Django AMF came first, and then PyAMF. And like AMF is just a message protocol. It's a binary message protocol for ActionScript. And like the bulk of that is figuring out how to turn Python objects into this binary representation. It has absolutely nothing to do with Django. Like, it's turning a Python object into an AMF object. But Django AMF, they started a project, and it was all Django-ish. And nobody else could use it because it was Django-specific. And then PyAMF came along, and they said, well, we want to be able to do this, but we don't want to commit to Django. And they made a Django middleware, and there's Django middleware right in PyAMF that you can use. But there's also WSGI middleware, and there's the stuff that does the conversion is separate from those two packages, or those two modules. And you can just use that straight up if you wanted to. So that gives you a lot more flexibility without a lot of extra effort for the developers. They created something that works for everyone. Which, no knock on Django AMF, but they didn't. They made something that worked for Django people, which is a subset of everyone, and maybe the most important subset, according to you all. Not according to me. And then there's other things like TGEXT Geo and Django Geo, and Pylons has this thing, Silverfish, which TGEXT Geo and Silverfish share a lot of code, but Django Geo is totally separate. Django has their own caching stuff, and then there's caching stuff that's WSGI middleware, Beaker. Like in the last year and a half, Django had the query set refactor, and SQL Alchemy had the, hey, let's make all our queries generative, which is basically the same job, but totally separate projects, doing it in a different way, doing lots and lots of work that was similar. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, depending on what you want, but it's splintering our efforts, and it's sort of changing the way that we work together. And that's a result, in both cases, of the fact that, in all those cases, of this sort of everything in Django is in Django perspective, as opposed to, hey, we're sharing with everybody. So my argument is that Django's philosophy leads to these divergent solutions, where there's a solution that the rest of the Python world adopts, and then there's the Django way. And I hope by now that you can see that maybe that there's a connection, or I'm trying to draw a connection between what happened to Zope 2 and what's happening in the Pylons world, or in the Django world. In Django, there's this divergence that happened in the Zope world. And in the Zope world, 5 years later, Python programmers didn't use Zope. Zope programmers use Zope, and Python programmers use something else. Because Python programmers already knew these other little bits. They already knew stuff that they could build on. Or they had to switch and give up everything they knew and go into Zope. Now, I'm not going to claim that Django is anywhere near as complicated to learn as Zope 2, because it's not true. But Django is much, much bigger than anything else that's a monolithic web framework these days. It's like an order of magnitude more code than is in Turbogears or Pylons. It's an order of magnitude more than, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more than in Wurzelkrieg or some of the other minor web frameworks. There's a lot in there, which means there's a lot to learn. And you can say, oh, well, you have to learn an ORM anyway, so learn the Django ORM or learn SQL Alchemy. But the perception, at least, in the Python community is that SQL Alchemy is usable all over the place, and the Django ORM is for using in Django. And I know, and I have used the Django ORM outside of Django. It's not that you can't do it. It's that people don't ever think, hey, I need an ORM. Let me download and install Django. That process doesn't happen. So this is my second talk about the present. And it's sort of inspired by, I saw this bumper sticker that said, shit happens. But I want to talk more specifically about good shit, not bad shit. And specifically, I want to talk about innovation. Things that are really good and make web development better. So innovation happens in Django. Like, there's lots of good things in Django. Django has, like, Django Geo stuff is awesome. There's all kinds of places where Django is making Python web development better than it was before. But innovation kind of happens everywhere. If there are smart people doing interesting things, innovation happens. So it's happening in Django, but it's also happening elsewhere. And here's a quote from a book called, what is the book called? I should know the name. I think it's called Innovation Happens Elsewhere or something like that. It's about open source and why you should use open source. And they say, silly as it sounds, this is the brutal truth. Regardless of how smart, creative, and innovative you believe your organization is, there are more smart, creative, and innovative people outside your organization than inside. So their argument is that this is why you should use open source, because there's all kinds of smart people outside of your community, your company, organization. But I'm going to make the argument that it's not just why you should use open source. It's why you should think about the rest of the Python web community as part of your larger community and not just think Django community. Because there are more creative, smart, and innovative people in the Python world outside of the Django community than inside of it. That's not to say that the Django people are not smart, creative, and innovative, because they are. And it's not to say they're not doing great things, because they are. But you don't have Mike Bayer and Ian Bicking, and there's a million really smart people. Maybe not a million. That's an exaggeration. But there's a lot of very smart web developers outside of Django. I mean, and hopefully, if you look around for a little bit, you'll see that. So I just wanted to show that more innovation happens elsewhere. So I made elsewhere really big. And yesterday, there were a number of people who said things about what they wish Django did, or if Django did this better, it would be awesome, or if Django didn't have this problem, that would be great. And this is just stuff that one guy, Mike Bayer, solved that people brought up as issues that they have with Django. So Beaker has, well, Mike Bayer and I think someone else contributed to this, but it has cookie-based sessions that are signed and encrypted. It has automatic handling of the dogpile effect. So if you cache something and then you want to get it back later, it just gives it back, even if it's not regenerated. And while it's regenerating, it gives back the old one until a new one becomes available. So you never get this, oh, the cache expired and 300 people want the cache thing, and it takes 30 seconds to regenerate. So we're regenerating it 300 times, which sucks. Like, it just handles that for you. And it's not hard code. And that dogpiling thing, actually, was in Mighty. And Mighty came out like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It's been around for a long time. And Mighty has sort of a head. It looked kind of bad and maybe not very Pythonic, so nobody used it. And they didn't notice that there was all this good technology in there because it looked stupid. It looked kind of Perlish. And nobody wanted it. And SQ Alchemy, Mike Bayer is also the SQ Alchemy guy. And there's multi-database support in SQ Alchemy and sharding. And obviously, one of the key things that SQ Alchemy has had from version 0.1 is the fact that you get an in-memory session of your database objects, and then you flush it, and that's when it saves back to the database. And that's called the unit of work pattern. Somebody was suggesting that would, Cal, I think, suggested that it would be really awesome if Django did that. And it would. But someone has already solved all of these problems. And I'm told that there's a patch that almost does this in Django, but it's been done in SQ Alchemy for 2 years. So my point is, you can take advantage of the innovation that happens elsewhere by using this stuff. And it's not like you're not allowed to use this stuff because you use Django. That is a good thing about Django, and it was not as true of Zope 2. So Django may not depend on outside packages, but that doesn't mean you should follow that lead. Like, you are not Django. Django is like, well, we want it to be easy to install. We want yada. You want to get stuff done. You want to make applications that work. And you want to use the best tool for the job. And you chose Django because you thought it was the best tool for the job. But if Django's session handling stuff isn't the best tool for the job, you should use something else. And then, if lots of Django people do that, and you write recipes, the Django people will be like, Why is everyone using some other session handler? Oh, and then they'll either fix theirs or something will happen, right? That's the pressure of markets. So my suggestion, and this is the end of my second talk, is that you should pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world as Django developers. You should look at WSGI middleware. You can use WSGI middleware now. And there's lots of it, and it's good, and it does interesting things, Beaker being an example that I just mentioned. But there's lots. If you go to WSGI.org, there'll be a list of a ton of things. And there's some that does profiling. There's middleware that does all kinds of interesting things. Almost every week, I see somebody release some middleware that does, like there's middleware that will keep track of the references to all the objects in your application so that you can see, do you have memory leaks? And it gives you a web interface where you can click on things. And as you click on them, you see who has references them, and you can click on those things. It's very cool. And I've not tried it with Django, but it should just work. And this is the kind of thing that Django developers, like, it would be awesome if people were writing up recipes for how to do these things. Like, they're easy to do. They might help you solve problems. If you have a memory leak, this is going to make your life way easier. Look at what other web frameworks are doing, because they might have good ideas to steal. And look outside of Python, too. There's lots of innovation that happens not in the Python web framework world. Or, and this is my second slide, which is the same as my first slide, do the same thing and then write recipes for how other people can do these things. So thus ends the second talk. The third talk is about the future of Django. And I'm going to make some suggestions about what I think Django could do differently to make a better future. The good news is 1.0 is out now. That means you kind of have some room to imagine what 2.0 could look like. You have some room to think about the future. You don't have to be like, oh, 1.0 is coming out a week from now. I can't think about anything else. So you get to choose what the future will be like. And you get to choose whether Django lives in the same world as the rest of the Python web frameworks, who all sort of share ideas with one another and code with one another, or will you live in a separate world? And I understand, like, the main reason that Django, and people do perceive this outside of the Django community, people think that Django is a different world. And the reason for that is because Django has no dependencies. Django is one package that you install and you're done. And none of the rest of us are doing that anymore. Zope has given up. Zope 2 was the last monolithic Zope. Zope 3 is not monolithic. Repose, which is a project to take Zope and turn everything into middleware, not quite everything, but it's made Zope very WSGI friendly. They make all kinds of things in Zope available. Turbogears uses some things that used to be in Zope. Zope, Turbogears, Pylons, all these people are sharing code and sharing projects. And that's not happening across all of these people, Django line. And that's mainly because I think many Django developers think easy install is crap. And I'm not going to argue that easy install is awesome. Easy install has some flaws. Turbogears has spent a lot of time working around the flaws of easy install. But I will say, like, in the last 6-8 months, virtual env, lots of scripts to make your own package indexes have made using easy install much, much nicer than it was before. You don't have to pollute your global Python package namespace. You don't have to do all these bad things that easy install used to do. You can use easy install in a way that gives you repeatable, reliable, clean builds. And we know how to do it, and we've been doing it. That was not necessarily true 2 years ago. I mean, 2 years ago, you could do all of these things. We just didn't know that this was the way to do it. We had to figure out all the pitfalls and figured out. But we do, I think now, have a reliable way to, you build a new virtual environment, you easy install from your own package index, you can pretty much guarantee that this is going to work, barring some craziness on somebody's machine that's crazy and could have blown up any install. So the question is, how is Django going to relate to the rest of the world? And some of it relates to this question that we had before, but I don't think you have to change your hatred for easy install to fix the problems. You can continue to hate it. You can hate it and use it. That would be my suggestion, but if you want to hate it and not use it, there's plenty of other ways to deal with this. You can do install scripts so that people don't have to touch easy install and you just use distutils. You can take WebOb, say you wanted to use WebOb, take WebOb code, pack it, copy it into Django, and use it. And there's some precedent for this, right? TurboJSON, not TurboJSON, but simple JSON is in the Django repository. Why? Because people need this stuff. And it works, and it's awesome. So everyone should use it. So the Django people do, and good for them. And you could do that with other things. It doesn't just apply to simple JSON. You could do it with WebOb. You could do it with other things. But I want to take a quick step back and say that there's two different ways to achieve excellence in design, excellence in web framework design, in graphic design, in art. One is that you have a bunch of options, and then you choose the best, and you keep doing this. And that's one way that web frameworks in Python have gotten better, is that somebody comes along and comes up with a new idea, and it's better, and selection happens. Sometimes this didn't work very well because there were so many options you couldn't choose at all, and it wasn't clear how to select the ones that were best. Another way that happens is that you continuously sort of redesign what you have. You look at the APIs, you're like, oh, could this be better? How could we clean this up? How could we make this better? And I have a Da Vinci picture because he was the master of doing this. He would design and redesign and redesign and redesign until something was awesome. So basically, this breaks down into two things. There's competition between web frameworks, competition between ideas, and there's collaboration across. And I think in an ideal world, Python web framework developers will be competing with one another because they have new ideas and they have better ways of doing things and they have new suggestions on how to do various things. I think form libraries, there's lots of places where we haven't gotten this figured out right. There's no right way. There's no perfect answer yet. So we should compete. And there's places where we know that we want a JSON library and we know what that should look like, so we should just all use the same one and be done and not write our own ones. So usually you have to do both of these things. And so I'd like Django to do both of those things. One thing, if I got my magic wand and said Django can be different, it would be to make things less interdependent so that you could actually, so that I could sell, because I think the Django ORM is the best ORM of its type. Its type being the active record pattern where you have objects that represent tables in the database, whereas SQL Alchemy has a much more flexible pattern. But it's a different approach to the whole ORM problem. And because of all the work that's gone into the Django ORM over the last year, it's really great at being an active record ORM. So I would like that to be successful and useful outside of Django. And I think it is. It's just not sold or marketed or approachable to a lot of people in that way. And it would be great if it was. And to some extent, making things more contained within the Django package will help that. Ideally, they would be separate packages because that's the key in people's mind that says, oh, I don't need Django for this. I can just install the one thing. But that's a lot of work. I'm not suggesting that the current Django developers do these work. I'm suggesting that some of you all who are just sitting here and like, hey, how can I contribute? Get off your butts and do some work. And if you do this, it will make Django better. It will make Python better. It will make everyone's life better. Another suggestion would be to make the request proxy to a WSGI environment dictionary. And this is kind of specific, but it means that the WSGI environment dictionary can then be authoritative, which then lets Django and other WSGI applications just all interoperate, and you can call WSGI applications from within your Django views, and all of these things could become trivial. And reusing a WSGI app in your Django app could be trivia. It could be just like use WSGI app, name of WSGI app, bam, done. You can't do that now. Like there's some work involved in taking your request object and turning it into an environment so you can call the WSGI app with the environment. It's just, yeah. Like it could be easy, it's not easy. And I don't think this is too hard. I know Ian Bicking has suggested just use WebOb, but you don't have to just use WebOb. You can use your request object. The only key thing that really matters is that the environment dictionary be the place where the data actually lives. And if your request object does that, awesome. Who cares if you have a different API for interacting with it than everyone else? Encourage people to use WSGI middleware. It works. There's lots of it. And then the other sort of bigger task would be to try and come up with some sort of WSGI middleware and Django middleware basically do the same thing. But they do them in very different ways. Well, reasonably different ways. And it would be nice if they were interchangeable, if you could have some adapter that turned Django middleware into WSGI middleware or WSGI middleware into Django middleware. It would be awesome. And I don't think it's a lot of work, but it's some work that someone would have to do. And it would make Django much more a part of the modern web Python world. So in conclusion, the future's not set. You get to choose, and the way you choose is you do some of this stuff, and you make Django better in Django because suddenly Django has access to more of what's going on in the rest of the world, and you make Django more usable to the rest of the world. You eliminate the divide that is sort of growing between Django and the rest of the Python web framework world, and you avoid, like, I don't think it was fair for the developer to say he took one look at Zope and ran away screaming, but he did, and that was his impression. And there is the possibility, as Django grows, that there's backlash and that people get this way. And part of that happens because the communities diverge. So if you keep the communities together, you're going to get less backlash from the outside Python web framework world. So that's my talk.
OK, and we've got 10 minutes for questions. Again, if you could approach the microphones at either side of the room. Here comes James.
James!
And we'll see how this goes.
Hi, Mark.
Do we have more than 10 minutes? James is going to take a while.
Well, you can bug me during the technical design panel.
No,
later,
I'm just giving you a hard time.
So kind of going to play devil's advocate here. Talking about pulling in external components and things. Like I've looked at pylons. I've used pylons. Pylons uses, and this is just an example, pylons uses Buffet for its templating API. But pylons
not
doesn't.
Anymore.
Well, okay, it used to. Pylons didn't just use Buffet. Pylons forked Buffet, included its own copy, and actually changed the way some of that worked inside.
Well,
so you weren't using external component, you were using Pylon's fork of external component. And it seems like that ends up happening.
So I would just say Buffet was maybe not the best idea ever. Buffet was basically a way to say, instead of directly calling your template engine, we're going to have a standardized API that lets you call any template engine with the same signature so that you can just switch template engines really, really simply. And the thing is, people don't want to switch template engines as often as all that. They're not like, hey, I'm switching template engines today, and I'll switch them back tomorrow. And it really matters that it's only one line of code. It just doesn't happen that way. But Buffet was never intended, like there was never a canonical Buffet implementation that people were supposed to use that was an installable package. It was a specification that was sort of hashed out on a mailing list 2 years ago by some guy from Cherry Pie and Kevin from Turbogears. And then there was an implementation in Turbogears that was very, very Turbogears specific. There was never a separate package. And this maybe was a mistake that we made, is that there was never a package that pylons could just install and use. There never was. Like, they had to install and use Turbogears to use Buffet, and they weren't going to do that. So I agree with you, but I also want to say Buffet is not a very good example because Buffet was a specification, not code, and it was a kind of wishy-washy specification, and they used the implementation that was different than ours, but there was never a standard.
Well, and it feels like what I'm getting at is that it feels like I can kind of turn some of your examples on their head and say, okay, I'm going to use Turbogears or pylons. I'm not thinking of myself as, okay, I'm a SQL Alchemy user. I'm going to think of myself as I'm a SQL Alchemy Mako Cherry Pie Turbogears user, and that's what I'm developing in. Even if they are separate packages, in my experience, and I've actually been doing research on this for a series of blog posts, which will get me lynched later on this year.
Awesome.
But in my experience, people don't generally switch out that often. I mean, like you said with templates, people don't really switch them. They pick what they like and just kind of run with it. So you get this, like you can say, I'm a Django developer, but at the same time, you get a lot of people who, it's a little more complex list of components, but that's the world they live in.
Right, but say their list of components is SQL Alchemy and Genshi and some other stuff. Well, I happen to be a user of SQL Alchemy and Genshi. I write GUI code. That GUI code uses SQL Alchemy. It has some XML stuff. It uses Genshi. I use Genshi in many contexts that are not web development related, as well as web development contexts, and the same with SQL Alchemy. So they're tools that are generally useful that also go into their web development stuff. So yes, people don't switch between those tools very often, but the fact that those tools are accessible and useful in multiple fields of endeavor, not just web development, or not just their particular framework, gives them a lot more flexibility and makes learning those tools worthwhile to them because they know that it will be usable in whatever context they're in. And it's true of the Django ORM that it's usable in whatever context you're in, but it's not obviously true of the Django ORM. People don't think that way, and that's all I'm arguing.
So it seems like you're talking a lot about the benefits of decoupling things and stuff, but obviously there's a cost too.
Right.
And I work at a Java shop, and we've been looking into Seam, and Seam, for those of you that don't know, is this amalgamation of like Hibernate and JSF and lots of other crap. And there's a definite cost to the fact that all these different components were not designed to work with each other, and that when you try and debug stuff, things get eaten and stuff. I'm not going to go into Seam. But the point is that if you've got a cost and a benefit to decoupling, where do you feel like we should draw the line, and how do you see that?
Well, basically what I feel like is that you should look at the coupling, you should look at the benefit, and you should look at the cost. And that making one decision saying always reusing something from somewhere else is better, is bad. And making the other decision saying never reusing something from somewhere else is equally bad, because you're not doing the cost-benefit analysis. You have to actually think. That's all I can say. Like, there's not one rule that rules them all. You have to look at the costs and the benefits. And I think the Turbogears 2 project has showed that Turbogears 1 maybe made some wrong choices about costs and benefits, and what to include and how to glue them together so that it was seamless. And you can do better than we did before. That doesn't mean it was a bad idea. It just means we got smarter. We know better. So yeah, there are costs and benefits, and particularly in non-dynamic language world. Like dynamic language world, you can write much thinner gluer layers, but also that make it much more seamless, even though they're thinner. And in Java, that's much harder to do. And so you end up with
So just with the specific
your
case
experience.
of web frameworks, you don't have any specific insights from your experience with Turbogears or anything on how to draw that line?
Well, I do think there's some really fairly clear places to draw lines. Like templating, like Django templates pretty much don't have to depend on the rest of Django. and they would work just fine. And they would be useful outside of web frameworks. Like you want to send emails, you want to do other things. Like they have some utility in a variety of places. So that's one example. I think the ORM is another example. I think it's a little bit harder, but like Geo is another example. It should, in my opinion, and I'm outside, but it should be a separate thing. Like you shouldn't just get Geo because you install Django. You should install Django and then install Django Geo, and then you have everything. So there's lots of places where it should happen, and it's a little more unclear. Like within core, like are there pieces like the file abstraction layer? Like is it too small to actually merit a package? Like those sorts of things, like they're harder to decide, and sometimes we go back and forth for a few weeks deciding whether something should be spun off as a separate package or not, trying to weigh out those decisions. And my suggestion is just that that discussion should happen, and it seems like it's not happening, or
So-
at least not happening as much.
We have time
Thanks.
for one last question.
So if somebody has a better question, mine's going to be a little bit hazy and weird. So
Does anyone have a better question?
anybody?
We'll take yours.
Anybody?
Hazy and weird is awesome. Your question is perfect.
So, I mean, there's this interesting tearing, right? Like, clearly the templates are well decoupled in Django, and I often replace them with Jinja, and that's awesome, and it works. There's all these desires in me to be able to use SQL Alchemy tools with, Django's ORM, and there's a desire in me to be able to use WSGI tools with Django middlewares and just to piece those together. But there's there's baggage that's coming along here, right? And the baggage is almost always admin. And it's like, well, or the baggage is how do we preserve the backwards compatibility ORM layer? Because there's not like a one-to-one mapping between Django's ORM and SQL Alchemy that's at least readily apparent. So there's this weird confluence of problems that have resulted in 3-4 years of discussions about how we could actually accomplish these tasks. So I don't really know where I'm going with a question of that, but I'd like to hear a little bit about like what you have to say about like this like.
Well, one thing I would say is that the admin is very, very coupled to
Right.
the ORM. And that is a fact, and it's actually a hard fact to avoid.
Right.
We have a project called Ramm that was a Google Summer of Code project that came out of Turbogears this year that's sort of like intended to be the Django admin that's just a WSGI app, so you don't need all of Django, you don't need Turbogears. It's just a WSGI app that you can use. And it has an interface, and then there's a layer of abstraction between the interface and the database backend, and it adds a level of complexity to the project to theoretically at least support multiple backends. But at the same time, like maybe that's worth it, maybe it's not. But the Google Summer of Code student did it, and he did a very, very good job, and it works. And he did it in a couple of months, and so maybe it was worthwhile. Like
Right.
it seemed to me like maybe this was too thick of an abstraction, and it was going to be crazy, but it happened. And like you have to try these things. Like there's a place for experimentation.
And I guess like my point is that like possibly not advocating all-out replacement, but like the classic example of having the Django ORM that just has my SQL Alchemy objects attached to it, so that if you build these things up from there, if I can dive back down into them, I don't really care that you have like the Django ORM that's for noobs,
Right.
AKA or whatever. You
Yeah.
know, like if I need to do this like hairy abstraction, I can do it.
Right. I mean, but then you're just taking that layer of abstraction that was in the one place and putting
but
it in the other place.
I love abstractions on abstractions on abstractions. It's
So
abstractions all the way down.
But I would.
All the way down.
Yeah, abstractions
Okay.
all the way down. I would just say I think it's very important to ask these questions, and that it's actually important to say sometimes there should be coupling.
Yeah.
Like it makes sense, I think, for the Django admin to be coupled to the Django ORM.
Absolutely.
A, because it was easy to get done, and B, because it actually works, and C, because like what else are you going to do? You're going to add this other abstraction. It's craziness. Like maybe it's not going to work. So my solution is not decouple everything always. And Turbogears exists because pylons decouples too much.
Right.
And so we want to actually say you can depend on SQL Alchemy being there.
Right.
And that's the Turbogears distinction from pylons, is like there are components and you can depend on them. But you want to keep the level of what do you depend on as low as possible and still get stuff done. And that's the trick.
So, again, for DjangoCon, we've been very careful about trying to get in people from outside the Django community, give us our perspectives. We had Cal yesterday, we had Mark again, Mark today, and so thank you very much, Mark Ramm.
Thank you.